Buonasera. Good evening, everybody. My name is Paolo Barlera. I'm the interim director of the Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight for an evening dedicated to Costantino Nivola and his work in New York. As you all know, this event is a companion to the wonderful exhibition at the Cooper Union, and I want to thank Stephen and Roger for organizing the exhibition and for partnering with us, especially tonight, and bringing some very distinguished guests to talk about Nivola. And to introduce our speakers, I would like to ask Stephen Hillier to come here, and I will leave the floor to him. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And Paolo, thank you very much for your partnership in this exhibition and the public events around it. On behalf of Dean Tarani, we just want you to know that we greatly appreciate that. And I wanted to also thank our individual panelists who are here tonight and looking very forward to hearing what they have to say. And I just briefly want to tell you a little bit about them because their credentials are quite astounding. Giuliana Altea is professor of contemporary art history at the University of Sassari. Since 2015, she has been the president of the Fondazione Costantino Nivola. She specializes in museum and gallery management. Her research interests focus on Italian art at the first half of the 20th century, the feminine, the primitive, the decorative, the post-war relationship between art, architecture, and design, and the artistic exchange between Italy and the United States. She is the author of many books and essays. She has curated more than 100 exhibitions, and she is currently the PI of the project More Than a Friendship, the reception of Italian art in the US from 1946 to 1963. Michele Bogart is Professor Emeritus of Art History and Visual Culture at Stony Brook University. Her areas of expertise include urban design and commercial culture, landscape and garden history, photography, illustration, and advertising. And she's the author of numerous publications, Public Sculpture and the Civic Ideal in New York City, 1890 to 1930, Artists, Advertising, and the Borders of Art, The Politics of Urban Beauty, New York and its Art Commission, and Sculpture in Gotham, Art and Urban Renewal in New York. And Michele is currently the Leon Levy Senior Fellow at the Frick Center for the History of Collecting in America, where she's examining art collectors who sponsored New York City's post-Civil War monuments. Antonella Camarda is director of the Museo Nivola in Orani and a researcher and lecturer in art history and museum studies at the University of Sassari. She holds a PhD in art and anthropology at the University of Sassari and a postgraduate degree in psychology and museum studies at Sapienza University of Rome. Since 2008, she has curated several exhibitions on 20th century and contemporary art and authored scholarly essays and books, and her volume, Lawrence Weiner, Attached by Ebb and Flow, is currently on press as we speak. And last but not least, Michele Cohen, who has served as curator for the Architect of the Capitol, the US Capitol, since October of 2015, where she oversees the curator division and is responsible for the stewardship of heritage assets throughout the Capitol campus. She began her career as director of the sculpture inventory for the Public Design Commission for the City of New York, and from 1989 to 2009, she served as the founding director of New York City's Public Art for Public Schools program. She also has written numerous publications, including the Art Commission and the Municipal Art Society Guide to Manhattan's Outdoor Sculpture, Public Art for Public Schools, chapters in The Decorated School, essay on the visual culture of schooling, and she has an upcoming piece, The Preservation Dilemma, Confronting Two Controversial Monuments from the United States Capitol, for the anthology Teachable Moments. So I'm now going to turn it over to our distinguished panelists so they can talk to us for a few minutes and then talk amongst themselves. Thank you.
There are 3 chairs, at least, not 4 chairs. We can go together. So let's use the microphone. Okay, thank you, Stephen, for your introduction, for your presentation, and thanks to the Cooper Union and the Italian Cultural Institution for organizing this panel. I think that many of you, if not all, having been at the exhibition at the Cooper Union, know the basic facts about Costantino Nivola, how he was born in a small village in Sardinia, how he went to study to the High Institute for Artistic Industries in Monza, which was an outstanding school for art and design in the 30s. Then he became the art director of the Olivetti advertising office in Milan, and being an anti-fascist, left Italy and came to New York in 1939. He first worked again as an art director for Interiors and other magazines. He met Le Corbusier and discovered his own technique, his own sculptural technique, sun casting, and finally he started a career as a sculptor for architects. This is Nivola in a nutshell. But let's speak of Nivola's commitment to public art. Public art is quite a tricky subject because it is an umbrella word covering a wide range of different art forms. You have the monument, you have modernist sculpture, meaning by this I mean a piece of art, a gallery piece moved into the public space without any relationship with its surroundings. But public art is also the opposite of this, because it also includes site-specific art, it includes art as street furniture, and finally it includes participation art, relational art, art as social practice, all forms that don't necessarily involve the creation, the construction of material objects, but have everything to do with the public sphere. What all these forms, these art forms have in common? They have in common the fact that they are supposed to be good for us, to be good for society. Modernist sculpture and many types of site-specific art and also art as street furniture, they start from the idea that by improving the aesthetic quality of the built environment, you can also improve the life of its inhabitants. So the city beautiful produces happy citizens, citizens who live well together. And in the case of participation art, but also of the traditional form of the monument, the goal is instead that of strengthening the social bond among individuals by to oppose the tendency of our society towards fragmentation. Well, Costantino Nivola shared both these approaches. He was a modernist artist, so he considered form as the center of the artistic creation and attributed to form the power of influencing the viewer, of producing a positive effect on the viewer. According to him, our sensorial perception had been dulled by the standardized condition of life in the industrial world. His art, his culture, with his richness, its formal richness, the variety of its surface, its textures, this kind of art was able to stimulate our senses and leading us to an intensified experience of life. He used to say that that art could help us to retrieve the lost taste of things. But art was also, for him, was also a way to foster a communal experience. This sense of community originated from his childhood, spent in a small village of 4,000 people in Sardinia, a very close-knit community where togetherness, where solidarity were all important values. And Nivola was nostalgic about this. But his desire for an art which reflected the sense of community wasn't just a matter of nostalgia. It also reflected ideas that were circulating at the time in the modernist circles. For example, already in the early 40s, the idea of reviving the form of the monument was very much debated among some émigré intellectuals in New York, who Nivola knew, Siegfried Gideon, the historian of architecture, Fernand Léger, the painter, Joseph Louis Sert, the architect and city planner. They all argued that even if the monument had been considered dead because it had been used as a propaganda tool by the totalitarian regime, it was worthwhile to revive it because people needed monuments, they needed emotion, needed shared emotion and occasion to come together. Well, Nivola knew all these people. He was especially close to Sert, who later on also invited him to teach at Harvard at the Graduate School of Design. And he was influenced by these ideas. Sert, he was especially close to Sert, and Sert was between the end of the 40s and the early 50s, the main proponent of a new model of city center. He wanted to introduce in the US something which didn't exist here, something equivalent to the Mediterranean square, the piazza. A place for people to gather, a place which could foster democratic life because bringing people together, they discuss and exchange ideas. The first project by Nivola to reflect this vision, this Sert vision, wasn't exactly a public project, but it was to be the basis of all of his subsequent public project. It was the design of his own garden in Long Island, which he did together with the architect, the Austrian architect Bernard Rudowski. It was a wonderful place, a series of connected open-air rooms connected by pergolas with the murals covered on independent walls, sculptures, fireplaces, a really magic place. And it was conceived as a place for his family, his friends, visiting artists to stay together, to socialize. Nivola called it a monument for celebrating life, the first of a series of such monuments that he designed and that unfortunately were never realized because they were too much advanced for their time. I recall just one of them, a huge kitchen sculpture with many fires for cooking special food in festive occasions. It's an idea that recalls some projects of contemporary relational art, for example, but in the 50s was completely unheard of. So they weren't realized, but the idea of celebrating life, as I said, was the starting point for all of his urban project for the schools, the playgrounds, the project for the social housing complexes. Even his memorials were designed much more for the living than for the dead. So Nivola's attitude towards public art was twofold. He considered art as an aesthetic activity, an activity whose main interest was aesthetic, but also as a background for people to socialize together. And so it was on one side modernist, on the other side, if not anti-modernist, at least not modernist. It was quite a complex attitude. There is one type of public art that Nivola didn't like, and was a political kind of intervention, which was too much confrontational, too much aggressive, that kind of intervention that aimed at exposing contradiction, at exposing tension, and disrupting the urban fabric in this way. When the famous controversy about the Richard Serra's Tilted Dark came out in the early 80s, Nivola was against the Richard Serra project. On the other side, they absolutely loved Maya Lin's Vietnam Veteran Memorials project. He sat in the jury of that competition, and he actively campaigned in favor of Maya Lin's design. He personally wrote to all his fellow jurors to support the project. And no wonder, because Maya Lin's memorial possessed all the qualities that Nivola looked for in public art: aesthetic quality, but also the ability to bring people together, to make them share emotions. I want to say anything more about this also because Antonella is going to delve more in depth in the character and the quality of Nivola's public project. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for all the fantastic scholars that intervened in this panel. I would start with a question. So, what kind of artist was Nivola, and what kind of artist did he want to be? So, if anyone in this room that studied modern art history, maybe not the youngest, but at least the other generation, knows that he worked during a long period of time. At first, when abstract expressionism came, in favor, then minimalism, and then conceptual art. If we look at this kind of art, we can see, and this is really a rough simplification, but you can see with abstract expressionism this kind of exasperate subjectivity. With minimalism, this fascination for industrial way of production. And with conceptual art, this idea that art should, reflect and analyze its meaning and its language. So nothing of this has nothing to do with Nivola. Even remotely, okay, it was really a different kind of artist. But, we would say out of art history. But today, luckily, art history is changing, and now we are seeing, it's showing us the new scholarship that there were the coexistence of different kind of artistic position during the 20th century. We have seen in this day all this kind of fantastic new discoveries of women artists, of non-Western artists that are enriching the cultural scenario. And I think that looking at Nivola in this new enlarged cultural field can also help us to understand this practice and this art. So my attempt here is to outline what his legacy is, looking at three things that really interconnect with themselves. So three elements: content, form, and material. So it's very, kind of, yeah, just follow me in this very, coarse simplification. So I'd say that the most, so when we see Nivola's work, what are we looking at? I'd say that the most recognizable feature of Nivola is the dynamic relation between figures that have actually the same look, that look the same, but have different sizes. We were also talking with Karstein the other day about it. So you find in Nivola's work these huge characters and small ones, and they overlap, so they stay side by side. So who are these people? Who are these characters? There is a series of naturalistic terracottas that help us to define who these people are. And this series is titled Gods and Humans. There are small people on the beach that, just lay on the beach. And then there are huge clouds in the shape of human forms, anthropomorphic figures. The humans and the gods. And this doesn't make Nivola pagan, but someone who experienced the contrast between the individual smallness and the individual constraint and the existence of some bigger purpose, some bigger ideas, something that escaped the everyday, dullness. And this dynamic is scaled in Nivola's oeuvre in various asymmetric couples. So we have God and man. We have teacher and pupil. We have the artist and the common man. We have the builder and the dweller, and so on. I could go on. So Nivola was also a man of his time, and he had a very traditional set of values. Also related to his status as an immigrant, in need of some kind of ground, some kind of roots. So we find in his work the father, the mother, and the child. This idea, this a triad, which is constantly present in a play of variation. So we have on one side this need for steady grounds, and on the other, the theme of the nuclear family that is also related to the theme of generation. The archetype that really melts, that really unites these two poles is the mother earth, which is paramount to Nivola. The earth in Nivola's work is never a background, is never landscape, it's always a character with its own presence. And it easily becomes a feminine shape. And on the other side, women acquire this kind of landy character. They become land. So I have mixed feelings about it, because this almost obsessive representation of women, of the feminine body by a male artist, is something that feminist studies today, had made us wary about, this objectification of the female body. But if I had to describe Nivola's gaze towards the feminine body, I would say that it would be a big "oh." It's full of respect, and it's this kind of, an overwhelming appreciation of what women stands for. It's beauty, but it's also this kind of power, the power of generation that was something that really was important. And this also this link with hurt for someone that was, taken away from his land really meant something to him. So anyway, what we can say now is that content in Nivola is very steady and consistent, but also is general enough to allow the artist to adapt it to different purposes, different commissions, and also to focus on what makes him really a modernist artist, which is form and style, and that's the second key element. So form is what interests Nivola the most. The simple combination of basic geometrical shapes that creates volumes, rhythm, light, and shadows. Color can have a role. Especially, it can cheer up the atmosphere. Think of the playground, the PS-17, for example, some graffitos. But still, Nivola is a sculpture, so color is something that can be added and integrated to the work, but it doesn't constitute its essence. Form, on the other way, is what allow the artist to escape naturalism, and this escaping provides him with freedom. It makes art an intellectual exercise and not a repetition of what is outside for everyone to see. Even so, naturalism is rejected, but the human shape is always present in Nivola's work. Is always at the basis of his very idea of art. Human representation is the beginning and the end for Nivola. His humanism is both an ethic and a politic stance. Never forget that. So, third thing, concrete, material. Concrete is the material of choice for Nivola, or at least it will be till the late 70s. Why? Because it's an humble material, because it's democratic, because it's ductile, because it relates naturally both with masonry, where it came from, and with architecture. It's modern, but it's not pretentious. It's also cheap. It's something that anyone can afford, and that's already an exercise in democracy, if you want. So let's go back to the starting question: what kind of artist Nivola wanted to be? Did he want to work for school, for public administration? Did he want to be a corporate artist? There is not an easy answer to that. I'd say that he found an opening. He found a possibility of making a living out of it, being an artist and doing what he wants. But I think also that he found that this kind of work was coherent with his vision and did not prevent him to exercise his artistic intention with freedom. So, if you look at the Stephen Wise area, the playground, bearing this in mind, and also bearing in mind what Giuliana said before, you can see why this playground is so relevant. It serves a civic and a public function. It offers Nivola the way to combine different techniques and different iconographies. And also, in the end, it creates an atmosphere overlapping the dull architecture of the two towers and providing a space for imagination, for free thinking, that possibly in his vision, which is idealistic, which is maybe utopian, could lead for social change. And I would stop there and leave the word to Michele. Oh, Michele. Thank you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed hearing your remarks. I mean, my sort of experience with Nivola is really very practical. I mean, I started learning about his work really back in 1989 when I began exploring all the art in the New York City public schools, and I encountered quite a few pieces by Nivola. It turns out about 15 commissions occurred in the New York City public schools in a fairly short period of time, post-war period between 1955 and 1973. And so as I surveyed these works, quite a few of them were in really horrible condition. Some of them were still quite intact. And, I started thinking about the relationship of those sculptures to the school building envelope, to architecture, but also trying to understand, like, how did the school community see them today? Were they effective? It was always the question I was always asking myself as I surveyed art, because in addition to looking at a historic collection, we were in the process of commissioning so much new art. And so always the question for me is, what can I learn from these existing examples? And so it's really interesting to me to think about Nivola on that panel for the Myelin project, because for me, I started seeing his work more in an architectural context than a public art context. And even at the time when he was receiving so many of these commissions, even the idea or term public art virtually didn't really exist. I mean, the way these things were commissioned was very different. It wasn't a case of having a panel of experts soliciting designs from artists, reviewing them, having community advisors. Artists were generally selected for the schools at this time primarily through the architect. So it was really the architect who took the lead and sort of had shaped the concept for the building and often had a concept for what the art could be. So it seemed to me from my experience of exploring these schools that Nivola in a way was sort of this perfect choice in that he could really complement these architectural contexts both in this sort of imagery that he was using because it was subtle. It was architectonic, it's geometric, but then there were also recognizable figurative elements. So it sort of bridged, it really was a bridge sort of between the environment and the user. And then in terms of the materials, it was almost an extension of the buildings themselves. So I think now we might look at him differently than at the time when he was receiving these commissions in the 50s and the 60s and the early 70s, when they were really seen, I believe, more as something sort of to complete that architectural environment, but not so much standalone sculptures. They were always in dialogue with this architectural context. And now we're facing the preservation of these works. And so it occurs to me that maybe you have to see them in light of architectural preservation, not just in terms really of sort of sculpture preservation, given his working method and the materials that he used. And I'm proud to say, and there are several people here in the audience who worked with me on this, that in 2003 we started the project to restore the sculptures at Beach Channel High School, which was really a monumental undertaking. We had to recreate one of the pieces and create a mold and recast it, and it was quite involved. And I think that project also gave me a renewed appreciation and understanding of Nivola, because it's a very complex project. There's 3 elements. It's on a plaza. And I remember seeing a photo of the high school students who were there in the 70s when the project was completed, standing with Nivola, and he was explaining the meaning of these sculptures to these students. And I thought to myself, well, he really is trying to find this universal language that is going to transcend its time. And I think some of the most successful pieces, he really did achieve that. I think some of the pieces, perhaps because they're not scaled as heroically, they're ignored more. So I guess just sort of to conclude my brief remarks, I found it fascinating that he was the sculptor of choice. More commissions went to Nivola than any other artist during that period. And I think that he really tried to understand how to sort of customize his aesthetic for school buildings, because the iconography he used, he tweaked it. There's references to education or the curriculum or this family motif, which is actually a very consistent theme in school buildings. So you see that in murals, from the 1910s, you see the family as being a really important motif. So I see how he succeeded, I think, in bridging that gap between the architectural envelope and the user, but also being true to himself as an artist. Because often when artists are faced with the challenge of doing public art, they sometimes sort of forget who they are artistically, and they sort of put on their public art hat, and they work in other materials or other kinds. They don't necessarily use the imagery that they're really comfortable using. But I think Nivola really sort of stayed true to who he was as an artist, no matter what the context was. Thank you.
I'm showing some slides, so I have to stand here. So excuse me, but I'm so excited about this, and the show has really, I don't know if you need that. Anyway, the show has really opened my eyes up to so many things. I have so many questions now, things I want to learn about. But my esteemed panelists are really the experts here. Let's put some picture on. So this is in Boston, actually, and I know we're talking about New York, but you'll see why I have this on. This is a mural that's in the Boston Government Service Building that was designed by Paul Rudolph and Associates, and the Nivola mural is inside of it. And you can see it's rather large and commanding. I've been taken by Nivola's work as long as I've known of it, although I haven't known of it as long as I should have known of it, partly for the reasons that you spoke of in terms of the way art history is taught. And so I actually, even though I've loved what I've seen, I actually knew very little about him or about the art. My consciousness was really raised, however, by the news of the impending destruction of this Paul Hurley building in the Boston Government Service Center, and thus the potential threat to the amazing Costantino Nivola mural inside of it, which is, as you see, it's a large-scale group of images with colorful and typically Nivolian hieroglyphic-style imagery that highlights government services to the people of Massachusetts in actually a rather traditional, old-school, New Deal type of way, which I also find very interesting. Like the building on whose walls it's embedded, the mural's future status is uncertain. So I realized my own lack of awareness was part of a broader lack of public familiarity with Nivola's work and its individual and broader art and urban historical importance, the significance of which we'll continue to be elaborating on in this panel. And I realized it was a function of the broader absence of public awareness of and commitment to mid-20th century art and architecture more generally. And I'm not talking about ABEX, I'm talking about stuff like this. Seeing the impact of this playing out, I've been seeing it play out now, not only with the works by Nivola, but also Richard Lippold, where his work in Lincoln Center has been removed, and even though that was part of the original complex, and there's no intention of putting it back. And so seeing the impact of this kind of victimization of mid-century art and architecture, I set out to use social media to try to counteract it a bit. One thing that really shocked me on seeing the Cooper Union exhibition, which is wonderful, and you all have to see it if you haven't, but one thing that shocked me and that reinforced my determination to celebrate Nivola's work as vociferously as possible was seeing not only the numbers of public commissions he undertook in New York City, and not, you know, the schools were huge, but he also did other things, was seeing the numbers, but also seeing how many projects were also either never realized, were realized, but like the mural in the Boston Government Service Centers, is in, you know, they're in danger of being or have been destroyed, which the show, you know, points to very clearly, or works that have been removed or relocated. So I'd like to know more about the specific circumstances of each of these cases, to know whether the problem was in part, and here, let's put on something. Oh, here's some more of this is the Government Services Center. So he's using his sort of inscribed approach, sand casting, but translated into concrete. And the government services being given to the people here. So I'd like to know whether the problem that one sees in the exhibition, that one aspect of it, again, still Boston. Oops. So here's a project that was not realized in the Kips Bay branch library in Manhattan. Here's the library, done clearly very brutalist style, and here's the sculpture that was not realized. I'll come back to this in a sec. But I'd like to know whether the problem was in part unique to Nivola because of just how many commissions he was given, which is a whole other question you raise and which I'd like to know more. How did he do it all? Not just how did he do it logistically, but how did he get those? Why? To know whether the problem is Nivola was not Nivola, but was his, something he encountered, or whether others did, or whether the issue was Nivola's path-breaking and idiosyncratic use of materials like sand and concrete. So we see, like here, and whether those idiosyncratic uses of materials like sand and concrete and their fragility and or rough edges and surfaces, which evidently was kind of an issue with this proposed work for the branch of the New York Public Library, the Kips Bay, where the director of the libraries made the excuse that it was feared that children would be climbing all over it. So presumably there are potential discipline, but also liability issues, the fear of like kid scraping his knee on the concrete, or whether it was a matter of Nivola's style, and that running into resistance at the time, or in subsequent decades, later decades, whether it was some sort of meshing of those two factors, as appears to have been the case at Manhattan's West Side High School, where the Art Commission of the City of New York, now the Public Design Commission, repeatedly disapproved Nivola's submission of a sculpture for the interior courtyard, which had this kind of, at least as it was ultimately completed, this kind of weird-looking juxtaposition of brick and concrete, of the blocky on the top, and then the attenuation of the pedestal, or whether there were other more straightforward and pragmatic reasons, like a school or government building being torn down or totally renovated, and where Nivola's art was an inextricable part of the wall, or the design, and hence, which is what Michele Cohen referred to. It's part of the architecture, and hence the aesthetic of the structure. At a time when preservation enterprises vis-a-vis mid-century architectural sculpture were far less committed or effective than they are now. And believe me, now they're not very effective, so you can imagine. I mean, even now, I find that the battle to save these works is waged by a very limited number of people, like maybe 3. In fact, but I don't blame anybody, it's just lack of awareness. So in fact, the problem may just be that Nivola's public art is a victim of a broader lack of appreciation for and understanding of the mid-century brutalist and bureaucratic modern, that's sort of a style, I think, bureaucratic modern aesthetics, like those, which you see in the Luckman Associates in the West Side High School. Here's the other sculpture that was done for that school. But that, there's a less familiarity with a public school architecture. People don't think about it, especially not the stuff from that period. And some of it's kind of odd, the way it juxtaposes these big buildings with sometimes these tiny little relief sculptures that are like stuck on the sides of the building. Not the Nivola, but in other cases I've seen that. But these bureaucratic modern aesthetics, like those practiced by Rudolph Charles Luckman Associates, fascinating guy I want to learn more about, and many of the other architects with whom Nivola collaborated. So I'll stop with that, and we'll go on with the show.
These two last speeches were so full of ideas, of interesting remarks that I don't know very well from where to start. Maybe I will try to answer to the question why Nivola was so successful. I think there were various reasons to that, but the first is that it was. It didn't compete with the architect. That is the fact. It wanted to be modest. The idea of pride in modesty was an idea that came from his beginning in Italy. It was a motto of the art historian Lionello Venturi, then and which came to Nivola through his master, the leading modernist Italian architect Giuseppe Pagano. Pride in modesty. The artist had to be modest, not to take the role of a protagonist. This, of course, was very convenient for architects, and probably wasn't so fruitful to Nivola, because in some cases he was to complain that his work virtually disappeared into architecture. This happened, for example, with Saarinen when he designed the 45 sculptures in the Morsen style colleges at Yale. But actually, to normalize culture, to make a type of sculpture which blended so fully into the architecture, so as almost to disappear, was something that Nivola wanted. So it was a contradictory position. From the one side, he wanted for his art to become a part of architecture, and I think what Michele Cohen said, that he was more an architect a sculpture for architects than a public sculpture, in the sense that we mean the word today. I think that was very true. But on the other side, I think at some point he suffered for this. And another thing that I found interesting was said by Michel Bogart, I think, about, no, now I don't remember exactly who said it. Because, anyway, about pursuing his own research, even when doing, it was you, even when he was making a public art. There is an explanation for this, because Nivola was a disciple of Le Corbusier, and in this he tried to follow his mentor's advice. Le Corbusier said that the artist had to go around always with his pockets full. What did this mean? His pocket had to be full of solution, of ideas, so as when a commission presented itself, the artist didn't have to catch up with the commission. He just had to rummage in his own pockets and to find the solution that he had elaborated independently. So there was no conflict between the commission as an external task imposed onto him and his own autonomous independent research. So, Anto, maybe you wanted to add something?
Maybe I want to ask something. Starting from what you once wrote about New York City and its visual culture and the relationship between what constitutes the visual culture of New York City, like, I don't know, lamps, post boxes, whatever, and then the material culture intended as the monuments, the memorials, what different kind of constituencies and communities, in a way, fight for, have represented or to install in the city. And here I reconnect also with Michele Cohen. How do we have to look at Nivola's art? What are we looking at? Are we looking at, some kind of curtain wall, some kind of tapestry that contributes to the visual culture of New York City, or are we looking at art? And I think that this, and I'm also speaking as the director of a museum devoted to an artist, is the main point. What is, I was asking myself what kind of artist Nivola wanted to be. But maybe we should ask what kind of artist is Nivola today? So I would like to ask your opinion about it. Both.
Go ahead. Well, I think for me, I've always seen him more in this architectural context than the public art context. And perhaps part of that has to do with the nature of how he got these commissions, that it was how schools were designed and how they were embellished at this time. So the idea was very much that the art would be an extension literally of the building, but also of the architect's thinking to some degree. And I saw that not just with Nivola's work, but many other artists of this period. And so it has to do with the nature of patronage at this time and what the public art process was. Mm-hmm. And so the art itself was 1% of the base building construction. They didn't have a separate budget for art. It was truly, in terms of money, an extension of the architecture. And so I think that's part of the driver. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
Well, yeah, I think it's both. I really do. I think because, I think one of the reasons why we don't know as much about, or at least I did, Nivola's work, especially in the municipal context, is that it was sort of subordinated to the buildings, and there wasn't the same kind of issue of access that there is now, I don't think. But there was a kind of mentality of pasting stuff on in the case of some of these buildings, not just school buildings, but also if you look at the civil courthouse, for example, on Lafayette Street, the stuff is just sort of stuck on there. And this became a big issue actually for architects and had to do with the city's process. But I've argued that Nivola is kind of a precursor. His work and what he was doing represented a certain civic vision and art, meshing art and architecture that would become realized through, and maybe help to inspire Mayor Robert Wagner's executive order of 1959, where Mayor Wagner signed an executive order which doesn't have the power of law, but the idea is that the city agencies are going to follow it. And it said, it called for agencies to embellish their architecture with art. And so it's kind of the precursor of what then in 1982 became the Percent for Art law. I mean, there was a certain amount of movement with that. But the point is that Nivola's practice represented this capability of both being individually aesthetically compelling and had a civic message to it that followed in the footsteps of these kinds of larger New Deal abstractions like government services or the student-teacher relation. I love that. It starts out as relationship and then it goes to relation. And just that concept, you have to wonder what that meant at the time it was done, because of course now people would interpret this very differently, which brings up a whole other set of issues about the reception of Nivola's work in today's schools, and whether kids like it, and Michele would know a lot more about that. But anyway, I also just want to say that I think the fact that he was an art director, that he had that ability as being an art director, to subordinate himself in a certain way, aesthetically speaking, to the broader project, or had to give credit for stuff that he may have designed to other people and stuff like that. I mean, that whole side of him fascinates me. But he clearly was somebody who could work with a lot of different people, and we can't discount that capability, people skills or whatever it was, on top of an aesthetic that was very playful and drew in from modernists like Le Corbusier and Léger and Saul Steinberg and others, that linear aesthetic, Theodore Roszak too. That was really attractive. And what is so interesting is that within the context of the modernist art historical story in the United States, at least, he isn't considered. He's not part of that, and he wasn't part of the scene in the mid to late '60s when the city started to get involved in doing public art projects in a way they hadn't before. So, I'm wondering, like, why is that? So there are a lot of really interesting questions, but I think he's both in a good way.
Should we open to the public? Should we open the question to the public?
Yes.
If anyone from the public want to intervene, Carl.
If I may, I'd first like to comment on something, and then I do have a question for the entire panel. I think that one of the reasons that Nivola was so popular with architects is he really was an architect. He wasn't a trained architect in the traditional sense as we know it, but beginning as a mason, a lot of his work was about creating spaces, about creating public spaces, and very exciting public spaces. And I think one of the great examples is his relationship to the Vietnam Memorial. And it was mentioned that he was on the jury, but he also was really responsible for the idea that became the centerpiece of the Vietnam Memorial, that was apparent in the Batan Corregidor monument, which was done in the late 50s. And when he wrote about it in its coverage in, I think it was Progressive Architecture, he described the excavation of the landmass of the island, and the experience of going into a gash into the land, a scar on the earth. And the exhibition the memorial was really to be presentations of some of the horrors of war. And then at the end, you come back to the sunlight again. And that was really the theme of Maya Lin's very powerful Vietnam memorial. And I find it just inconceivable that she was not aware of that. It was really very much in the mainstream at the time. And this preceded the Vietnam Memorial by 15 years or so. So I think one of the reasons he was so often chosen by architects to work with is that he really saw the use of art as being, at least in many cases, involved with creating architectural spaces in a public sense. And there was, at least in my experience, very much a dialogue in all of the work. As a question, the issue was raised about the duality of the gods and humans in his work. And I think that it would be interesting to have each of your opinions about the relationship of the godlike figures, which tend to be the more abstract, geometric, idealized figures, and then the small figures, which are the narrative of the family existence in many cases, the very literal descriptions of that, and also how that related to his garden, where the focal point, the places that were the public place of his house, were at the intersection of the axes created by the house itself and the axis created by the studio and the sandcasting pit. And that came together in this wonderful outdoor space that included a place for cooking, a place for sitting and talking. I mean, there are these wonderful photographs of the various gatherings at the Nivola house in this garden at the intersection of art and daily life.
If I have to answer the question, which is, this relationship between gods and humans, so I would say that it's a relationship that in terms of size, but it's like they are made of the same fabric. There is kind of an exchange, an interchange between them. And relating to this, but also to the issue of space, what we see in Nivola's work is this alternate vision of things from above and things from eye view. And you see that, you mentioned the Corregidor monument, which has a sculptural quality that it can only be appreciated from above, but then you have also to walk through it, into it, having, of course, a completely different understanding of the space, of the... So I think that, in a way, this is how Nivola understood life, but also his capabilities of making art and of living. So moments when you are small, when you need to be down to earth, and then moments when your thought can just go up to the skies and reach a height where you can see things clearly. And it's almost moving, because he was this very little man from a humble origin, but he managed through his skills to make a living, to become someone, and this is also because he identified himself with another great character from Sardinia, which is Antonio Gramsci. I must say a bigger character than him. but same humble origins and same capability of finding, of the strength of his thought. And in the Gramsci monument, which is another unbuilt monument that Nivola worked on, I don't know, for a lot of years, you see this very small room that represents both Gramsci kitchen, where his mother used to hang him, trying to cure him for his problem with the back, but also the fascist prison where Gramsci was imprisoned. But this small room has no roof. So Gramsci thought can, expand itself and, escape the constraints of work. So this dynamic is always shifting, and I think it's one of the most poetic things and achievement of Nivola's art.
About the coexistence between the big figures and the smallest one, I think that this difference of register brings us to another kind of coexistence, the individual and the collectivity. Many of Nivola's reliefs are not a depiction of individual figures or characters. They are images of collective life full of episodes. When you see them from a distance, you just notice the outlines of the crowd, the movement of the lines. But when you get closer, you start to distinguish a lively series of small episodes. These two dimensions were very important to him. Individual life and collective life were the two flips of the same medals, and also this was part of his individual experience of this unique adventure that was his life. One of the most, I think, fascinating aspect in Nivola is the close, the proximity, the strict adherence of his artwork to his biography in some sense. Of course, Nivola was a modernist artist. He transcended his personal experience into an abstract kind of representation. But at the same time, the main, as also it comes clear from what Antonella said, the main threads of this personal experience continuously emerge from his work.
Okay. Well, in some ways I sort of see it in a very practical way, like you see something on a building, you see it from a distance, and it carries a certain you have a certain formal appreciation, and then you get up close and you start seeing it revealed in detail. And I think it's how we always view art. We get up close, we step away, we get up close, we step away. And so much of the work that's in a public space, often you're just walking by, so you just sort of get a snapshot of it. And then if you're really engaging with it, it draws you closer, and then you start discovering some of these details. But and the other thing I think that Nivola does when he incorporates these details, it's often they're fun or they're witty, they're spontaneous. And so it's sort of the child in all of us. I think he really appeals to the child in us, because it's like he's just taking his finger and drawing in the sand, and there it is, a permanent imprint. And I think that's another quality that makes it actually very appropriate for schools, when he's able to sort of identify that universal impulse that we all share.
Right, and it seems like some of the ones for the schools, the figures, the little figures are more
modeled or
articulated than they are in some of the other kinds of projects. I might be wrong about that, but
so it's like access. It's giving the viewer access. So it's like you don't just have to deal with my modernist cubistic forms. You could recognize school subject matter, and you see a little figure, and you see a teacher, and So it's a way of personalizing, customizing, targeting a specific audience. But I do especially love those graffito things, because it really is so spontaneous. And so I think that's a wonderful quality that he captures that makes his work widely enjoyed, I think, and I think why people respond to it, because they see that.
So, yeah, I mean, I agree with all of this, and I think this is what makes him, he's a great humanist artist. We're so cynical now that that seems, problematic in some way. Not for me, but so I have a question in that context of whether, when you were doing the work for the schools, whether you'd see kids interacting with the stuff, or was the decay of the work a function of, was there vandalism?
Well, there are two types. There's institutional
Concrete falling
vandalism,
apart.
which we unfortunately know too well, where
Right.
custodians who are well-intentioned paint things that shouldn't be painted. And so that totally transforms them. And then there was the environmental issues. And then there was also, just vandalism, I would say, that students. But I think one of the issues with the conservation is the fact that it is concrete, so it's not seen as this precious material. It's not seen as a sculptural medium. So it's seen as, something that's expendable in a sense, whereas if it were bronze or marble or granite or some of these more traditional materials, I think perhaps people would have reacted or respected it differently over the course of time.
Right.
And so, so I'm not so sure that students now, they were seeing really many times a degraded piece. And so it's always it's a real problem because they're not actually seeing the original at all.
Right.
So it makes it a lot harder for them to appreciate it.
So I think one of the things that's needed, very much needed, the exhibit, the Cooper Union exhibit, helps to make some of this palpable, but sort of beyond that, as far as advocacy is concerned, is the need to be able to articulate to people what those surfaces were like, and why his surfaces and in play with the forms, how they communicated and why that was important. And honestly, this is what one has to do in order to get, to say, have it register with public officials or journalists who then go and write about this stuff. And there are a few who are doing that. So if one can, bring that forward and make it loud, it will do a lot of good, I think.
And this exhibit is wonderful,
yeah.
wonderful. I was so thrilled, actually, when you all contacted me. It's like, oh my goodness, other people care about Nivola too.
I'll just throw in something here. I can't resist because what you're saying is very, very true. We've been doing walking tours, we've been doing tours of the exhibition. Thanks. Students and people generally, but kids especially, do respond very much to this work. Every school we've gone to and spoken to kids, they recognize, they know what we're talking about, they can identify themes in the work. I don't think there's much you have to do to convert the students. It's much more a question of getting the custodial staffs and then the administrations above them to recognize that they have something that's valuable and needs to be taken care of. And once that happens, I'm actually struck by how little of the work it has received vandalism. And I think we all know the piece at Stephen Wise, the horses, that were vandalized within a few months of their installation. I believe that was by an adult. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it was by an adult. So I think that part of the battle is one. It's getting the powers that be to take care of what they have. But my question, I guess, is, since these are valuable artworks, how do we, if they are preserved, is there any other intervention that needs to be made to identify them as being something valuable, whether it's labels or plaques or I don't know, fencing. I'm not suggesting any of
Talking
these things.
sculptures.
Yeah, but ways that they can be, where their place can be more secured for the future.
I can speak to some of this question. I mean, in terms of their value, or that they're valuable. The one thing that we cannot do is put them on a pedestal. I think the public stuff, and so. But it is a matter of multiple forms of education, whether it be through something short, some sort of a plaque. I mean, who did this thing? When was it done? Who's the architect? And even, a line about what makes it interesting. But then there just needs to be this kind of ongoing, a website or something like that. I mean, you've done this with your school stuff, and and podcasts and things like that. So then, things come up, like now I see anniversaries or this or that. And people who are interested will draw attention to it by pointing to an older podcast or an older statement about the Olivetti showroom and stuff like that. And so, I mean, I'm a big fan of using social media for some of this. It may not trickle down to to kids but over time, once the stuff enters public consciousness of some sort as being worthwhile, and it gains some sort of name recognition and, dare I say, celebrity, that's the wrong word, but PR, then it when it enters some of that canonical consciousness, that's part of the educational process. But I think, the first step is simply making people aware of it, and of saying stuff about it. So it's not just sort of like it's there, but that they have a sense of what is significant about it in a very simple way. So I think combinations of little plaques or stuff in the, and bring it into the public school education at that school somehow. If that's, I don't know if that's remotely possible, but so there are a whole range of things. It's just a matter of getting people passionate enough about it to say something about it.
Yes. First of all, congratulations for making such a deep and thorough presentation of such a wonderful artist. And thank you for letting me know that it's pronounced Nivola and not Nivola, as I used to. In the 70s, I worked for a few years in the cultural office of the American Embassy in Rome. And Costantino Nivola was artist in residence at the American Academy for 1 year. So I went to the Academy. I had the pleasure of meeting him. I interviewed him for the art magazine of the embassy, and he was so thrilled and so grateful that he gave me one of his terracotta beds that I still keep and cherish. If I'm correct, it was the first time he had gone back to Italy after leaving it during the fascist regime. Correct me if I'm wrong. And I want to ask to the ladies from Sassari, how did that experience at the Academy impact his life, his art? Did it make a difference? What do you know?
No, it wasn't actually the. Thank you, by the way, for your witness. It's very interesting, and it's always nice to meet people that had actually the chance to know him personally. Actually, it wasn't the first time that he wasn't, because he came to Italy quite regularly. It was always very linked also to Sardinia. But
Came the first time in 1947.
yeah,
After the war.
Yeah, he was also thinking of moving back to Italy, but then situation in terms of the jobs were not ideal in Italy like it is nowadays. So he decided to stay in the US. But I think that when he went to the American Academy, in terms of his artistic vision, he was a very mature artist. But still, it gave him confidence. And also it offered him the ways to experience Rome again. A city so full of art, or of memories, of culture. And it really shows, just an example, he started to think about doing historical paintings. So Italy and Rome got into him in a way. And also he made a very interesting connection again, or renew, like with Cederna, who was an environmentalist from from Italy, and this fostered his new sense of sustainability and environmentalism. And then he became friend with another Sardinian artist, Maria Lai, who was living in Rome, and this was also an important moment, because he passed on her some very important, notion about art, ideas. So it was a very interesting intellectual exchange. So I think that it was a late coming to Rome, but it was very important for his political views, for his views on how the world was going, and it wasn't going well. At the end of his life, starting with the 70s, he was very pessimistic about the world, about the environment, about the politics, and he was right, yes. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I had one comment about how we could get more information out there based on my own experience of teaching public art at City College, and then also a question for the panel. One is, usually at the start of the class, when I ask people what works of public art do you pass every day, they would say, oh, none. And by the end of the semester, they'd be coming with me, do you know about this one? Do you know about that one? And it occurs to me the way that not only could we embed it in the curriculum in general art history classes, but we take students to museums as a regular thing. Why don't we take them around to the public art in their neighborhoods? That's how you build a sense of ownership and caring. That's that. My question for the panel was, how relevant or useful do you think it is to think of in the context of Nivola's evolution, for the theory of the integration of the arts from the Bauhaus, which of course came over here with Sert and a lot of other people, or, moving back a little, this notion of the Gesamtkunstwerk, because it strikes me that the way he works with architects would be a kind of realization of those kinds of concepts. And of course, as architectural styles change and philosophies change, that becomes less relevant.
Nivola's relationship with the Bauhaus group was very important, actually, because when he came to the US and started to work in the Interiors magazine, the first thing he did was to go to Harvard to meet Gropius and Breuer. And he also was in contact with Xanthi Chavinsky, another wonderful protagonist of the Bauhaus, a graphic designer who had been in Milan before. So Nivola met him in Milan, where Xanthi Chavinsky used to work for the Olivetti. When Nivola arrived in New York and found again Chavinsky, it was for him a very positive moment, because he felt, lonely, he felt in a new environment. It was in a completely destabilizing situation at the moment. And Stravinsky introduced him to the milieus of the other modernist emigres, of the master of modernists who had emigrated in New York. And another encounter he did in that moment, at that moment, was that with Joseph Louis Serre. So it was a crucial contact. Later on, he became very close also to Gropius. For example, he was invited to speak at the anniversary celebration of Gropius. Gropius' birthday was celebrated every year by his friends and colleagues, and Nivola, in one of these occasions, was called to speak. This shows how intimate he had become with all that circle. And of course, the basic idea of the Bauhaus influenced him. For example, the metaphor of the cathedral. Do you remember the manifesto of the Bauhaus with that wonderful woodcut by Feininger, showing a cathedral with projecting different lights from its steeples. I think it is steeples, and the lights symbolizing the various arts, all encompassed by architecture. Nivola shared that kind of vision, so as well as he shared the ideal of the medieval cathedral, where the architect, the mason, and the visual artist worked next to each other. So it was very important.
So it's kind of like he, through looking at the art history or that period through the lens of Nivola, he kind of, I mean, it enables one to see potentially not how small the world was, but I mean, he's kind of a bridge if one looked both broadly, but also, you know, in the archives, which is what I like to do, between the more traditional ideals, civic ideals, New Deal ways of thinking, which are more abstract than, say, the Beaux-Arts approach, and then the high modernists. So you know, I didn't know about this connection with Gropius and Harvard. So he's somebody who can work with, and does, and connects with the high international style people, both on a theoretical level, but then on a personal level, with those people, with the corporate world, which, you know, a lot of times the art history world used to do more so than now, like to cordon off that kind of activity. And then the mundane, municipal, bureaucratic realm of the public school system. And, you know, which is great. It's really terrific to be able to see how all of that, you know, one person is able to navigate all of that.
And I think the thing we have to keep in mind with Nivola is just how practical he was. Like, he was not a high-maintenance artist. I've worked with those. I don't think Nivola was one of them. I mean, not only was he thinking like an architect, but he was so hands-on, and he was just able to just get the thing done. And I'm sure he was able to do it cost-effectively.
Right, on time.
Yeah. Well, he pointed at the fact that his culture, his invention of sand casting, was important also for economic reason, because it normalized, so he used to say, sculpture, transforming it in one of the components of the building site, one of material as another. It could be shipped at at the same cost, he said, as if the cost of shipping a sculpture was just a practical matter. Unfortunately, it isn't. But so he said, at the same cost than the other materials, and the frameworks, the wooden frame he used to pour concrete into the molds, they became crates. So he was a very practical man, and he was a wonderful networker. This is you pointed at it very rightly, because it is extraordinary. We could add also other contacts to those you mentioned. For example, he was in contact with the circle of the so-called New York intellectuals in the 40s, with Dwight MacDonald, with Nicola Chiaromonte, whom he found again when he went to Rome in the after the war. He was in contact with the anarchist circles. He was in contact with the anti-fascist circles of the Italian emigres, with the Mazzini Society, which was, the hub for all the writers, politicians that fled fascism, that had fled fascism. And that was because he was a wonderful human being, I think. I think he was at the bottom, that was it. Everybody who knew him remembers him as such. I think Carl Stein here, who was as lucky as to be his friend, can witness to that.
Was he giving any sort of guideline to the school projects, or he had like carte blanche regarding subject, the materials?
Well, I think that's such a great question here for Carl.
Because I was very impressed in the playground, the just sheer amount of visual, the sheep, and then the horse. Were there sheep or horses? The horses, and then this graffiti. It's so varied and so many visual languages at once. I'm very curious to know that.
I mean, I'll only just say with schools, you had certain opportunities, architectural opportunities. But in terms of Nivola's response to, would you like to talk about that? Your collaboration with him?
Well, first of all, the main project that I did with him was very late, and that was for the combined facilities, police fire facilities. But my father worked with Tino on probably half a dozen schools. And at the time, I think it was expected that his work would be concrete, that it would either be carved concrete, carved green concrete, or sandcast concrete. A starting point for all of the work, including the project that we did together, was what was the budget? I mean, very seriously, how much work can we do? And depending on the medium, the amount of work varied. I mean, for the combined facilities, the first thing that he did was call Bob Spring at the Modern Art Foundry and say, how do we figure out how to price bronze? I mean, for a series of reasons, we had decided to do the work in bronze. And once that was done, then he worked back from that and said, well, we can do, I believe it was so many pounds of bronze within the budget, and that leaves me enough work to pay for 3 months of developing the work and a month for actually creating the final models and so forth. The same thing was true with the concrete, where there'd be an understanding that concrete sculpture was this much per square foot of face area of concrete. And then sitting down with the architects and saying, well, how does this relate to the space, to the architecture? I think for me, of the public schools, I think PS 55 in Staten Island, which is still in relatively good condition, was the best of the projects that Tino and my father did together. And in that case, it's a building that has a concrete frame that's exposed, and the artwork becomes really a continuation of the architectural concrete, and it was done very much in a collaborative way. I can say that, for example, in the combined facilities, which unfortunately doesn't exist in its current state because of some gasoline pumps that were installed where they, from an architectural point of view, shouldn't have been. But the idea was, how are people going to be coming into the building? How can we create a series of bronze sculptures that create an experience of the art from the sidewalk into the door, and then into the lobby and the vestibule, and then into the lobby itself. So the idea there was that because there was a limited physical size that the budget could afford, how do we use small figures to create the experience of entering this building? So in terms of how the work was developed, I think that for the work of the late 50s into the late 60s, I would say, there was an expectation that it would be geometric concrete, an expectation both from the client, the public agency, the architect, and Nivola. The way that it was integrated was very much directed by Nivola. And as I said before, I think that his vision of how the public work would be used was to create space, or to create passage or transition. That it was very much an architectural planning vision for how the art worked as part of the larger experience. So I don't think it was so much a retiring point of view about what the art was. It wasn't a thinking of it as being less important. In fact, really almost the opposite. It was that the art became major events in the architecture, and he was very much involved in not only making the art, but helping in the process of defining the entire setting.
That's really insightful to hear that. Thank you so much.
One more question.
Thank you. In studying, really, because I spent so much time in it, the exhibition the other day, I was very impressed by the later work, paintings, and also the terracottas, but particularly the paintings. Does anyone have anything to say about the style of his painting of New York City street scenes or cityscapes?
It was in the beginning when he started to represent New York in his, then it was drawings, basically drawings in the early 40s. He looked, somehow he looked to Steinberg. He was very close to Steinberg, and Steinberg's graphic style influenced him. But I think that he transformed this kind of suggestion in a personal way, because in those paintings, the contour, the outline is much thicker, and they are full of an energy which reflects a tension between the vitality, the vitality of the urban landscape, and something threatening, something certain anxiety that it conveys. So it comes, in part, the style comes from Steinberg, as I said, but it's a completely different version. Sorry.
Yeah, you can definitely see buildings put among themselves. You have a whole wall of these black lines, and then you see different architectural forms there. You even see, sometimes you see a little face or something like that. To me, it just seems like a different artist. I can't quite put
Also,
them together.
the buffet is another source in the later works, because the painting you saw in the exhibition are from the late 70s, and that was a reprise it did of that subject, and I think that some inspiration he drew from Dubuffet, which was an artist he very much admired.
Yeah, that change to his later styles, just very interesting to me.
Yeah. Also, maybe it's interesting to remember that he called this series of paintings "The Unbelievable City." For his experience of New York, that must have been overwhelming when he got there. Later, transforming something that he owned the city, and at the same time, he couldn't stop looking at the city and discovering all these new pieces and all this kind of, almost crumbling or overlapping or mixing buildings. It's actually a very realistic representation of how the light change, how the building, how a glass building reflects on another. So it's actually, in a way, it's very realistic, but then it's transfigured by his vision. I think that it's a wonderful series.
Yeah, and even at the lower levels of some of them, street action, tourist bus, things like that happening.
Yeah.
Thanks for responding.
Okay, thank you all very, very much for a very illuminating and enlightening conversation, and giving us some food for thought in terms of hopeful next steps we can take toward restoring some of these works. And to everybody in the room, if you have not been to see the exhibition at Cooper Union, we're open through this coming Sunday, so please come on down. Thank you. And thank you, Paolo.